deep within the heart of the Southern California desert. Just a few miles south of lavish resorts lies a seemingly forgotten world. Glimmering in the distance like a mirage, a mysterious body of water seems out of place in the parched desert landscape. It's the largest lake in California, yet even nearby residents don't know it exists.
Have you heard of the Salton Sea?
I've never heard of this sea salt. What did you call it?
Is it salt in the sea or salt of the sea?
I've heard it's around California, Nevada. Am I close?
Somewhere over in Europe area.
Do you know what body of water that is next to you?
No, I don't know that one.
The Salton Sea.
No.
Does that ring a bell?
No.
Something about 80 miles from here?
No.
Nothing?
Is it a corporation? Is it a...
No, it's a big lake in California.
Oh, Salt Lake City? Salton Sea.
Salton Sea.
It's like one word.
Salton. Like
Salton.
S-A-L-T-O-N.
Oh, I honestly had no idea about that.
Salton.
I thought it was two things. I'm sorry.
Do you have any idea what that is?
That, well, definitely isn't the Salton Sea. No, I do not know what that is.
At one time, the Salton Sea was actually one of the most popular tourist destinations on the West Coast. Today, though, its beaches are deserted, littered with the bones of millions of dead fish. A casualty of the water wars in the Southwest, the enormous sea is quickly shrinking. The receding water reveals a toxic mix of fine dust and chemicals that is threatening the health of millions. If nothing is done, it may become the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. For over 50 years, experts have predicted this would happen. Millions have been spent on research, and plans to save the dying sea have been debated for decades. So why has nothing been done? Could salvation lie beneath the sea's murky waters? Will the solutions transform how we create energy on our planet? Can the Salton Sea be saved? Or is it already too late? The story of the Salton Sea begins millions of years ago, when the Gulf of California stretched north from Mexico. Once the Gulf receded, this vast depression, almost 300 feet below sea level, would periodically flood, filling the Salton Basin when the Colorado River would change direction. The most recent of these inland seas, Lake Cahuilla, once covered more than 2,000 square miles, but evaporated in the intense desert heat 400 years ago. At the turn of the 20th century, this stretch of desolate landscape had become known as the Imperial Valley. Pioneering families came from across the country, hopeful of building a more prosperous life in a new land. In 1901, developers began using the Dry Alamo riverbed as a canal to bring irrigation water from the Colorado River 80 miles away. By 1903, more than 100,000 acres of crops were being grown. But just 1 year later, sediment clogged the canal, choking off the lifeblood for the region. Engineers made several unprotected cuts into the river, and water once again returned to the valley. In the fall of 1904, though, surplus agricultural runoff had spread into the Salton Basin, threatening to destroy the New Liverpool Salt Company. Then in the spring of 1905, the southwest region was inundated with record rainfall, creating a swell of epic proportions on the Colorado River. The poorly constructed canals were violently breached, and the entire volume of the river poured into the valley. Farmland, homes, and railroad tracks were quickly submerged or destroyed. For 18 months, numerous attempts were made to close the breaks, but the mighty river could not be contained. Finally, in February of 1907, the Colorado's flow into the Imperial Valley mercifully came to an end. In the river's wake, an inland sea of massive proportions was left behind. Covering close to 600 square miles, the Salton Sea was born. In the 1930s, boat races on the sea attracted thousands of spectators, as world records for speed were set in the buoyant, salty water. Tourism continued to expand, and by 1950, the Salton Sea was the second most popular recreation spot in California. During the 1960s, more people visited the sea than even Yosemite National Park. In the early 70s, however, fluctuating sea levels began to flood shoreline communities. The situation worsened in 1976 and 77 as rare tropical storms brought torrential rains, causing massive destruction. For the next 5 years, above-average rainfall continued to flood the valley. By the early 80s, much of the remaining property along the shore was abandoned and left in ruins. Tourism vanished. Then in the 1990s, massive fish and bird die-offs plagued the sea, further destroying its reputation.
They're calling it the worst die-off of birds since the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. 120,000 of them at last count.
Thousands of dead tilapia, 2 to 3 feet wide along the edge of the sea.
At one time, it looked like a freeway of belly-up fish, pressed up out 1/4 mile.
People would come in and have to push their boat through 15 feet of dead fish piled up on the shore. That made it into the newspapers, and it became less of a place that you want to go and spend the weekend.
The paradise that once was the Salton Sea is now gone.
The Salton Sea is poisoned, and it's teetering on the edge.
A strong odor of sulfur hangs over the region.
It has become a dumping ground for toxic runoff and pollution, killing millions of fish.
I've heard stories about it. Be careful if you swim in there. You'll come back out and your flesh will be eaten. It's not that kind of toxicity.
The nickname California's Dead Sea is more appropriate.
A lot of the newspaper activity basically speculated that the fish kills were because of bad agriculture. There was dumping of toxic pesticides. The newspapers concluded that there had to be some kind of a toxin that was causing all this without any knowledge at all. We now know that a lot of the fish kills are due to a hydrogen sulfide during the summertime, which actually doesn't kill the fish directly. It strips the oxygen and the fish suffocate. And in the wintertime, these fish die from low water temperatures. On the other hand, the bird kills were the result of some really exotic transmissions of classic avian diseases like avian botulism. So we've solved some of the mysteries and debunked the myth that it was agriculture or pesticide dumping or something like that.
Three little fishes
Despite the truth, misconceptions persist, and the sea's appearance continues to leave a lasting negative impression. If you search the internet, you will find most articles describe the region as a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Many people still believe the sea is a toxic waste dump that's not worth saving.
Man, it's nasty there now.
The water's stagnant, it's polluted, and it's an environmental nightmare waiting to happen.
It looks kind of like a scene from Mars.
I would never fish there ever again. Man, that place, man. Oh, wow. No.
I wouldn't go swimming in it. No, I wouldn't get close to it.
It is sad that, people have the misconception that this is a polluted place, that only individuals who are weird live out here, and that it is a post-apocalyptic area, but no.
In fact, the water quality in the Salton Sea, although it's very salty, it's not actually that bad. Yes, there's farm runoff. Yes, there's a little bit of pesticide and a little bit of fertilizer in there, but it's also full of biological activity that eat all of that stuff. So the actual concentration of toxic components in the Salton Sea water is actually quite low.
In fact, it's not polluted at all. Pesticide residues and other things are all sequestered in the sediment, so it's really surprisingly clean.
You wouldn't drink the water the same way you wouldn't drink seawater. It's loaded with salt, but you can swim in it, you can boat in it, you can fish in it. The challenge is sometimes it can smell bad.
I think it's a stinky mess.
It smells really bad, like
It stinks. It smells terrible.
Salton Sea smell like blue cheese.
People get confused, and the smell that we smell today, to me, is no different than going to the beach in San Diego. I smell the same smells. To me, it's life and death. It's what we see in an ecosystem. The smells that people probably are referring to that smells like rotten eggs, that's hydrogen sulfide. It is very noxious odor, and it can be toxic.
There's something in the air at the Salton Sea, and this time of year, it typically stinks.
Rotten eggs. That's how people are describing the nasty stench hovering over Southern California.
Smog regulators spent $200,000 on a stink detector.
I usually just smell and say, that stinks.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Maybe the Salton Sea needs a Rolaids.
We started receiving complaints of rotten egg smell all over the basin, not just next to the Salton Sea or not even just in Coachella Valley. So we essentially had H2S being distributed for up to 100 miles throughout the basin. For most of the basin, it wasn't exceeding health standards, but close to the Salton Sea, we got some pretty high readings.
One of the situations at the sea is that it's hyper-nutrient rich. So we have algae blooms and then busts. The fish population explodes and then crashes. All of those nutrients settle onto the bottom of the sea, and typically that's a very salty, dense layer of water at the bottom. It's cooler, denser, and so it doesn't mix well with the surface water. All it takes is a slight wind, though, to turn that over, and suddenly we've got all of those nutrients coming up en masse.
The things we'd expect at the levels we're seeing are basically nausea, headaches, and things associated with a really strong nuisance odor. There could be other effects longer term if you were exposed to a high level very long term, but that wasn't the case in this situation.
What do they have standards for it, though, if it's not that big a deal? I mean,
well, it is a big a deal. We take it very seriously. The standards are set by the state to protect public health, but headaches and nausea are not something to laugh off either. I mean, if you're having those effects, it can snowball into other health effects as well. So we don't think anybody should be experiencing headaches or nausea from air pollution anywhere.
These events, as the sea recedes, will become that much easier to turn that water over as it's shallower and shallower, and the nutrients are more and more concentrated.
Some experts described our drought as the worst on record.
This is what drought looks like in the state of California. It is a virtual desert.
From the north end all the way down to the south end, everyone is being gripped with these bone-dry conditions across the state.
Water is a scarce resource in the Southwest. What we've seen in the last few years, especially on the Colorado River, is that source is going to be challenged because you've got increasing needs in the basin states and a decreasing supply.
Most people don't realize the major metropolitan areas of the Southwest, including LA and San Diego, it's about 10% of the US population. And we rely on essentially one river, the Colorado River, for much of that water. A lot of people are attributing the extreme drought that we're going through and the more frequent or prolonged droughts to climate change. And this may be our new normal going forward, and so we need to adapt to it.
IID has one of the highest priority water rights on the Colorado River, but the river is overtaxed, and we think over in the next few years in particular with this drought, we'll have even more problems with delivery of water. So it's incredibly important to be able to balance the agricultural and the industrial use against things like the Salton Sea. It's an important part of the economy and it's an important part of this area. And so we need to have some balance.
Imperial Valley farmers grow 80% of the nation's winter vegetables, generating more than $5 billion in total economic impact. It takes a tremendous amount of water to grow crops in the desert, though, and almost 1 trillion gallons from the Colorado are used annually in the Imperial Valley. For decades, southwestern states have been fighting over this precious resource. California historically overused its share of the Colorado until a landmark agreement in 2003 forced the state to reduce its water consumption. As a consequence, though, water was diverted away from Imperial Valley farms, resulting in less runoff flowing into the already shrinking Salton Sea.
In 2003, the federal government got together with all of the water users and developed a quantification settlement agreement. As part of that, IID transferred 300,000 acre-feet of water to Coachella Valley Water District on the north end and over the mountain to San Diego County Water Authority. The reason for that was the industrial and the populations over there needed that water.
The QSA is the largest agriculture to urban water transfer that's ever been done, and it's a market-based transfer, so San Diego is paying Imperial Irrigation District for the water.
The price paid for that water pays for Imperial Irrigation District to upgrade its delivery system. So you're talking about flooding fields in the past and moving more towards drip irrigation, concrete lining of lateral canals, things of that nature. In the mid-'80s, and certainly leading up to the QSA, the Imperial Irrigation District has been accused of wasting water. And so this mechanism allows them to become more efficient with their water usage as California's largest Colorado River water user.
The QSA was sort of a carrot and stick agreement where it was like, we're going to pay you for this water if you do it this way, but if you don't, we're probably going to launch lawsuits against you for wasting water. So it's your choice.
It's undeniable that as a result of the QSA, the Salton Sea will shrink. As the Imperial Irrigation District moves into efficiency-based conservation, less water will make it to the sea.
The conservation is great, and we all need to conserve water, but when you have a lake bed that relies on water that's used in the fields to keep the lake at a certain level, that conservation is a problem.
When we started the transfer, none of the conservation measures were in place. But initially, we had to conserve some water for two things. One, to deliver to the partners in the QSA, and the other for the Salton Sea, because until 2017, IID agreed to deliver Colorado River water to the sea.
The final cutoffs at 2017 are dramatic and immediate. So as much as we've seen some reduction in the level now, it'll become far worse and much more rapid in 2017 and beyond.
The Salton Sea is one of a unique class of lakes that are classified as terminal lakes. That means it's one way only. The water comes in, everything that it carries with it comes in, and the water evaporates. In our case, the inflows from the New and the Alamo contribute roughly 4 million tons of salt a year.
3/4 of the inflow comes in from those two rivers. But those two rivers are really just part of the irrigation system. They're agricultural return flow. Both channels would be dry if it wasn't for the agriculture inflow.
The current salinity is roughly 54 parts per thousand. To put that in perspective, the average of all the oceans in the world is somewhere between 35 and 40 parts per thousand. So we're roughly 50% higher than, say, the Pacific Ocean. This is one of the, if not the most productive fishery in the world. We had 4 species of fish. We now have basically the one species, tilapia. The estimates are in the tens of millions, 20, 30 million, maybe 100 million, but those are just estimates. We've talked to fisheries experts, and the experts have designated that roughly 60 parts per thousand is when we expect the tilapia and most of the fish to disappear.
So you're saying no matter what happens, 100 million fish are going to die?
It's inevitable that the main water body of the Salton Sea will get over 60 parts per thousand. That is going to sooner or later cause a fish die-off, yes. It's not that the fish will die, they just won't reproduce, so over 5 or 6 years you'll lose a fishery.
We suspect that as soon as the fish disappear, that we'll lose basically half of the species of birds. As we go further and further, and if nothing's done, we get to losing the various suites of invertebrate species, then eventually you have no birds that can use this site. We've been told they'll find someplace else to go, and yet we have no idea where that might be.
This is the center of the flyway for not just birds that are migrating on the Pacific coast, but for half of the continent. For many species, this is absolutely critical.
424 bird species have been seen here. That's among the highest, if not the highest, number of bird species recorded on a national wildlife refuge in the entire country.
Very few people have ever been here in February and seen these massive fleets, these great armadas of the white pelican. It's the most amazing bird I've seen in flight. Nobody knows that. Nobody's seen that unless they come down here and see that.
85% of the North American white pelicans winter there. 90% of the North American eared grebes. For many species, they don't have any place else to go. This is the only place in the continental US where we have ground nesting brown pelicans, 10,000 or so. Double-crested cormorants, these are seabirds that would otherwise be along the coast, but those habitats are gone.
With the loss of wetlands in California, which has been very dramatic, more than 90% of the homes and food where wildlife birds have foraged and lived in the last 100 years are no longer there, better than 90%. We have areas like the Salton Sea that are making up for that, for the birds that survive today. They're dependent on that for their life cycle. If the Salton Sea isn't here providing those values, food, water, shelter, they're potentially going to be losing their lives. It's going to break the migratory path that they're taking on their flight south of here or on their way north. It is vitally important to those birds that live here in their life cycle. Their lives are dependent on it.
We requested an inventory of all birds that were ever banded at the Salton Sea, wherever they were relocated in the world. We got that information, it was plotted on a map, and it provided some surprising connections. We didn't expect a connection with the Texas Gulf Coast, and yet it was there. We have birds that were recovered far into Central and South America. We have birds that were recovered into Central Asia. It really illuminated that this is not just a regional resource. It's an international resource.
Today out there's probably close to 100,000 birds feeding and getting good meals throughout the day, and it's keeping them healthy. You take that out of the equation, and where are they supposed to make that up at? There are no options. There's only so many food resources in any particular area, and if we start cramming 20 birds in an area that's meant for 10, then they all start starving. If the Salton Sea were not here in the future, it will have wide-ranging impacts outside of this area.
Fate of the struggling Salton Sea is a hot topic as the water dwindles, exposing lake bed and sending unhealthy dust into the air.
Strong winds blasted dust and sand through the skies of Southern California, including Palm Springs last night.
In a matter of seconds, the sky looked like this.
Officials issued an advisory stating the winds caused particle concentrations to reach unhealthy levels, and people are urged to avoid outdoor exertion.
We're not talking about fish and wildlife anymore. We're talking about human life and the potential human health catastrophe that could happen if we don't find some way to stabilize and maintain the Salton Sea.
We're talking 2017, 2018, 2019, we would have significant areas of the current seabed exposed and potentially having huge dust storms and the resultant problems that would occur from that.
We're already seeing vast exposures on the South Shore, as much as several miles out from where the waves were in 2003. If this continues, we'll see enormous expanses of very arid, saline, silty sediments. That is a potentially very serious problem if, in fact, the sea is allowed to recede, which would expose those sediments to the desert winds.
When you have a surface, like a desert surface that may have once been wet, it generally crusts over. A little bit of dust starts blowing, and that dust itself breaks the crust. and then that crust is broken and more dust gets kicked up. And that, in turn, breaks more crust and kicks up more dirt, and you get this chain reaction, and before you know it, the whole surface is emissive, and everything is just blowing up into a huge dust cloud.
It's a very fine, salty dust. It makes a large plume that travels across the entire valley.
Dust from this area travels over the mountains to San Diego, Orange County, Los Angeles. If this were gone, there would be intense dust storms, and that would make a lot of people sick. It would kill people.
These sediments are so fine, 2.5 millionths of a meter. You could get 30 sediments in the width of a human hair. They're so small that if you inhale these into your lungs, they can perfuse straight into your bloodstream, carrying with them whatever chemicals are attached to the sediment. That would be cadmium, arsenic, selenium. Not good things.
The most serious effects that have been observed for particles have been cardiovascular, so perhaps heart disease. There's been all kinds of studies with the very small particles that show they can move throughout the body. They've shown some neurological effects in the brain. In some of the animal studies, they've shown effects in the kidneys. So pretty much every organ or every system in your body has been shown to have some effects from these particles.
We need only look as far as Owens Dry Lake for a good example of what could happen. The Owens Dry Lake, situated on the southeast side of the Sierra Nevada, was dewatered by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in the 1930s. And that exposed an area of about 25,000 acres, what was Owens Lake, as now Owens Dry Lake. The Air Quality Management District there has actually issued emergency warnings for people when their dust storms get really serious, to where they evacuate their own staff out of the basin. They've had recordings of more than 25,000 parts per million. This is choking dust that you would suffocate if you were exposed to this. Luckily, the Owens Valley only has several hundred residents that live there. When we compare that to the Salton Sea, we're looking at 4 to 5 times that area of exposure, with 1.5 million people that live in immediate proximity to the sea. Mind you, the baseline condition in the Coachella Valley, Imperial Valley, exhibits the worst hospitalization rate for respiratory disease in California. That's the baseline condition without the sea being withdrawn. Children and elderly are most susceptible to particulate pollution and respiratory disease that comes from that. This really came home to me some years ago. One of my colleagues on the Salton Sea Science Subcommittee, his 13-year-old daughter passed away from an asthma attack in the Imperial County. And that really struck home to a lot of us that this is serious business, and we're exposing our children to this. Not just locally, but this is going to impact all of us within 100 miles of the basin. We're easily within range of these dust storms. We cannot afford to let that happen.
I understand the magnitude of what is coming. That's a toxic soup beneath and in the soil, and you don't have to know that it's happening to understand that it will. Look at the wind here. This is a windy place, and it carries. It's simply not that far away.
Those lovely dust tornadoes that we get will be full of toxic chemicals, and they're not going to stay in this town. They travel. It goes into the air, it goes into our crops, it goes into absolutely everything.
So you're already noticing dust in the air, huh?
Living in it now. I sweep the floors of my house every day of white sand.
I wake up in the morning with sand.
I've lived in Brawley most of my life, and there's health issues that a lot of families have suffered, from cancer to other health conditions, and we see a lot of younger children that are becoming sick. I really care about the community that I live in. I care about my children because I know that they're the next generation.
If we don't do anything about it, it's still going to cost billions of dollars just to keep the dust from blowing, and billions of dollars in healthcare costs. To do nothing is not a good alternative. It's very expensive, and it would be deadly.
Time is now for action.
The time is right to act.
The time for action is upon us.
Now is the time.
We cannot afford to wait.
The time to begin cleaning up the Salton Sea is long overdue.
It's only a question of time.
There is not time to fool around with this any longer.
Not enough is being done.
Another year from now may be too late. So let's quit talking about it.
Let's get on with the job.
We are committing with this bill to fix the Salton Sea.
Despite years of study and research, there isn't a good plan in hand right now.
Here we go again. We have been studying the Salton Sea now for well over 30 years.
Everybody in the state wants to do something about the Salton Sea. The reason things haven't been done is because we don't know what to do.
If all we do is continue to study the problem, we're going to end up with the worst documented environmental disaster in history. What you need before you get there is a roadmap.
They say, let's be more thoughtful, or let's have a better roadmap. What this really means is they want the Salton Sea to die.
People see the studies and they know that it's a joke. They'll see the front pages and the headlines and they'll say, no more studies. It's time to prove that we'll finally get serious here and clean up the Salton Sea.
On this vote, the yeas are 221, the nays are 200. The bill is passed and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
You had a major effort back in the 90s to come up with a plan, and they did come up with something that maybe could work. And then the QSA was signed, and much of the inflow is now going to go to San Diego, and suddenly the problem has changed. It's going to get much more severe, much faster. So you've got to reevaluate the whole thing yet again.
The state of California is on the verge of determining a plan that will permanently save the Salton Sea. Deterioration in local air quality due to blowing sediments are a very serious reality. The status quo, Mr. Chairman, is simply not an option.
We have an F phrase for you down in the area around the Salton Sea, and it's called fed up. We were fed up with the process of moving responsibility for restoration of the Salton Sea from one committee to the next.
The federal government, the state government has taken now years, decades to do nothing. And because we're sitting here talking about it now, that means it's not going to be done in time to save this shrinking shoreline.
"16 years, $40 million more studies. We're still in the same place. Nothing's happened. There's nobody local to stick up for the Salton Sea. Even Senator Boxer was here a few weeks ago. She gave a rousing, great speech, said we cannot let this happen. But she's been in Senate for 20 years, and she's let it happen. I mean, they've all let it happen. They all give speeches saying we can't let it happen, and yet it's happening.
I'm just kind of disgusted that they can't make a decision, you know, either do it or don't do it. And that's the thing that irritates us here in the valley, I think.
Once it's on the brink of destruction, it's like, oh, let's save it. Well, you could have saved it 50 years ago. You could have preserved it 50 years. You could have preserved it 20 years ago.
There's going to be so much more money because they waited so long to do it. That, I mean, if they just shut up and do what they're supposed to do and get it done.
You're not very optimistic about our politicians who make these decisions.
No, I'm not very optimistic about any politicians. I'm sorry.
The sea's been studied to death, and I'll just be kind of blunt so people can make money. When you're studying a place to death and nothing's happening, there's a lot of people making money off of the state or federal coffers, but all it is just a show.
I understand the frustration. The scientists are just as frustrated that we're not moving forward with actual projects on the ground. They're asking of us to get stuff going and stop studying. That's not a wise strategy because we need to know, how is taxpayer money being spent? Is it being spent wisely? Are we achieving what we want to achieve?
We do live in a community with demographics of over 85% Latino population. Much of the population does live in the low-income minority. Not only do we not have the resources as a community to offset the impacts that are potentially going to occur as the Salton Sea recedes, but people just have a lesser opportunity to move. For example, they can't just pick up and move to San Diego. The cost of living is so much greater that, I mean, they have no other option, and that's why it's just becomes so important to solve the issues now in a proactive manner before we get to point of no return.
To find out what's really going on, you need to go around the sea and talk to the folks that live there.
Frankly, as a mother of 2 children, that scares the heck out of me.
They know what's happening, and I get a sense they have a very realistic, pragmatic take on it, that probably nothing's going to happen, that they're going to be stuck holding bad properties and living in an unhealthy area for a long time to come.
What you get to is, as the sea shrinks, you ultimately have landowners who own parcels currently underwater. As that land becomes emissive, they are going to be ultimately responsible for air quality impacts and whatnot. The primary landholders are the Imperial Irrigation District and the federal government.
Well, I guess it depends on who you talk to is who's responsible. I think IID's position is that the state of California legislatively promised to restore the Salton Sea, and that's the reason the IID agreed to the QSA, or the water transfer.
The quantification settlement agreement caps the liability of the water agencies at $300 million. They'll hit that real easily, real quickly. And beyond that, the liability is borne by the state of California itself. We, the taxpayers of California, are going to pay for this one way or the other.
They tie us to their plans. We'll bury them in the sand before they bury you in the sand. Don't bury your heads in the sand. Fight it while you can.
In the last 40 years, more than 200 proposals have been presented to save the Salton Sea. A lack of funding and serious disagreements over which plan should be adopted has resulted in very little getting done.
We have a state plan with a $9 billion price tag. The catch is there was no money from the state to do it. We're at a juncture now where we're trying to figure out a way to ask them to work with us at the local level to come up with a hybrid plan of some type that is more reasonably priced and that can be done in small bites at the apple along the way, and get off the idea that there's only one way to solve the problem and it's going to be solved in Sacramento.
One of the biggest issues we need to do over the next few years is manage expectations. We don't think the Salton Sea can be returned to the 60s and 70s. And I think people need to recognize that.
We haven't got enough water to supply a sea of the size of 50 or 100 years ago. Could we supply a sea of a third that size? Yes, probably we could, even with what we see as the lowest future amount of water that we would bring in.
Our plan is to try and do some incremental habitat and air quality mitigation measures around the sea as it shrinks to cover that playa area. So you end up with probably shallower areas of the Salton Sea, but you end up with water on a lot of those areas, or you end up with some other kind of land use.
What we would like to see is the state and the federal government come to the table and be part of the team so that we can get the strings off some of the money that's available there for planning efforts and begin a renewed environmental impact report and study of what alternatives maybe are available today that weren't even thought of 10 years ago when those studies were last really updated.
Until they take all the water away, we have the opportunity to do some scale of restoration. I've heard people that start with, if we lose the fish, we might as well walk away from the lake and just let it go because there's no hope. I'm not in that category. There's always hope as long as we've got some water to work with, even degraded water.
So we've got this plan moving forward that doesn't preclude full-scale restoration if you want to do it, if you find the $9 billion, but it does something incrementally as we move forward.
Maybe they can fund something smaller to get things going, and maybe we can get in the private funding to get the rest of it happening. I'm hopeful, but it will be a big challenge.
It got pretty depressing when the decision-making went to Sacramento and they hired a bunch of new bureaucrats and spent $25 million on who knows what. We lost a lot of our momentum. Well, we've regained that in just the last couple of years. And I'm confident that we have the initiative now. So how are we going to pay for this? Well, the solution comes from one of those other special things about the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea sits on top of perhaps the largest geothermal resource area in the Western Hemisphere.
This area is prime for geothermal energy development. It's all part of the tectonic system where the Pacific plate is grinding fitfully past the North American plate, and the faults open up these windows into the deep earth where heat comes up, and that can be used to produce electricity and then transport that electricity to where people can use it.
There are two fields that produce 75% of the geothermal energy in the United States, and that is the geysers in Northern California and the Salton Sea field, Heber and Brawley. To be usable geothermal energy, you have to have heat, you have to have a fluid, and you have to have permeable rock that allows the fluid to move through the rock and harvest the heat.
It's been estimated that we have 1.9 to 2.5 gigawatts, that's 2.5 billion watts of geothermal power there, available 24/7, forever. We're up to about 350 megawatts of geothermal power online at the sea today, and there are numerous other proposals that are pending right now. There have been some other discoveries of rare earths in these geothermal brines that they bring up from depth, such as lithium, the same stuff that powers our cars and makes batteries. Most of it's produced today in Argentina and Brazil at great expense and through very elaborate solar evaporation process to generate the lithium supply. It's $5,000 per ton, and we depend on this for batteries and computer cells and other things. The lithium in these geothermal brines, however, turns out to be at a much higher concentration. We're talking about increasing geothermal generation by 50 times. The Salton Basin would quickly become the lithium capital of the world. And then we look at solar. If we put them on the exposed lake bed, I've calculated rather conservatively, we could easily generate another 4 gigawatts of power on just 10,000 acres of the lake bed. Add to that the 2.5 to 4 gigawatts of geothermal. We're looking at a renewable energy mecca several orders of magnitude greater than anything else on Earth. Algae is an interesting prospect out at the Salton Sea. If we took algae production facilities and we put them on the inflow tributaries to the sea, the New and Alamo rivers at the south end primarily, what they would do is take up the nutrients, the nitrates and phosphates coming off from the ag fields, produce oxygen as a byproduct, and grow lots of algae.
We have made fuels from the algae oil. We've flown airplanes on it. Every single engine that could be run by conventional oil has now essentially been run by algae oil. The sort of ingredients you need are you need water, but it doesn't have to be fresh water. It can be marine water or brackish water or even wastewater. You need good sunlight and you need good temperature. So Imperial Valley is a fantastic place to grow it. They thrive in salt water. If we put an algae pond on top of those exposed playa, we will get an economic benefit of creating jobs, and we'll get an environmental benefit of we don't have the exposed playa to blow down.
This is going to be huge. Talk about investment. Between the geothermal energy, the solar energy, the biodiesel algae production, this is going to be the energy mecca of the Western Hemisphere, clearly. Suddenly we're talking real money. Enough to make the $8 to $10 billion infrastructure cost payable in a relatively short time with regard to its return on investment.
Millions of homes in the Southwest could be powered by the renewable energy developed in the region. But it won't happen quickly. Building the power plants and transmission lines will take many years. Everyone hopes this public-private collaboration will deliver some of the funding needed to save the sea. But much more will be required to halt this rapidly approaching disaster.
These governmental agencies know how and have the power to fix any of the things that we're focusing on, but without a push from the community, without a loud cry from the community, nothing's going to get done.
Save our city! We need to be held responsible. It's our responsibility to take up the cause, take up the banner. and make this happen.
People can make a huge difference by participating. And so we need to make sure that we are proactive in engaging the community, because they're the ones who are going to be living here. They're the ones whose children are going to be raised here, and it's going to become the labor force for future generations.
We don't have time to sit around. We are sending out an SOS, Save Our Sea. People need to step up right now. Send a letter to the president, the governor, anyone that you see could help this situation.
There's a lot to lose if the sea, is not saved. I sometimes pray about it. With my children, we pray, and we know it's gonna happen.
I really encourage everybody that can take a day to come out here to look past some of the rundown shacks and to look past at some of the fish bones from the fish die-off and actually see the beauty.
It is strikingly beautiful. From its east shore, you can see some of the best sunsets on the planet, where the sea becomes calm and still. You could skip a rock on it forever, and you see the sunset over the still waters with the dark silhouette of mountains on the opposite shore, and it's a sunset like I've never seen elsewhere in the world.
Come and see this place for yourself. That's one of the ultimate things. Once you see this place, it changes your heart, it changes your soul and your spirit, and it makes you realize that we're all connected and part of something much bigger that we can have a truly positive and wonderful effect on. That is what will fix the Salton Sea. Not being sad because of what hasn't worked, but being happy and optimistic for what will work. We have to come together to save our sea.
The Salton Sea has reached its breaking point. To do nothing is no longer an option. This is an example of the many difficult choices we are faced with in our country. What are our priorities and how do we value our nation's resources? Why do we so often wait until a tragedy strikes before taking action to stop it? The Salton Sea could be a great environmental success story or an unprecedented disaster. Only time will tell, but time is running out.